Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky gave the expected order. The Ukrainian army has launched the offensive operation it has been planning for months. It took action to take back the Luhansk and Donetsk regions occupied by the Russian army. The Ukrainian army, which organized 29 different land operations in one day, managed to push back the Russian forces by going on the offensive with a large army. Making a press statement recently, Alexei Danilov, the head of the Ukrainian National Security and Defense Council, said that they have been preparing an attack plan against the Russian army for a long time, and that the Ukrainian army is now ready for such an attack. Alexei Danilov told the BBC television channel that they will take action within a week to take back the territories occupied by Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. He said that the Ukrainian government has no margin for error and that this offensive is a historic opportunity that they cannot lose. Days after Danilov's statement, the Ukrainian army launched 29 different ground operations to take the regions occupied by the Russian army. After these ground operations, 1,200 Russian soldiers lost their lives, while many regions under Russian occupation were liberated. The Russian Defense Ministry announced that they have detected that the Ukrainian army has launched a major offensive in the Donetsk region and that they are trying to repel this attack. Although there is no statement from the Ukrainian government, after Moscow's statements, it is said that this attack is the first stage of the Ukrainian army's major offensive plan. According to the statements, the Ukrainian army has launched 5 different ground operations in the Donetsk region alone. In a statement made on its social media account, the Ukrainian General Staff stated that Russian forces resisting the offensive of the Ukrainian army started to organize airstrikes. Ukrainian officials stated that the Russian army carried out airstrikes with Iranian-made unmanned warplanes against the areas where the Ukrainian army was on the offensive. But the Ukrainian army successfully repelled these airstrikes. The Russian military is said to have launched 40 missiles and 40 airstrikes in the last 24 hours, and 51 rocket launchers were fired at Ukrainian military positions. Ukrainian officials said that 6 cruise missiles and 6 unmanned warplanes belonging to Russian forces were successfully destroyed. The Ukrainian army, which managed to repel the attacks of the Russian army, launched a land operation against the Russian-occupied Lysychansk region by going on the offensive again without wasting much time. Ukrainian soldiers mobilized from Lyman, Izium, and Balaklia regions, forming a large contingent of 12,000 soldiers. The Ukrainian battalion, which moved towards the Lysychansk region through the city of Lyman, confronted the Russian forces there. 11-74 model Ukrainian tanks bombarded the defense line of the Russian army in the Lysychansk region for hours. Ukrainian soldiers who fired tanks at the abandoned buildings where Russian soldiers were stationed managed to drive Russian soldiers out of the buildings where they were hiding. With the dispersal of the Russian defense line, the Ukrainian army, which went on the offensive with a battalion of 12,000 soldiers, entered the city of Lysychansk. After hours of clashes, the Ukrainian army managed to capture the city and force the Russian troops to retreat to the Luhansk region. Ukrainian commanders stated on the Telegram channel that more than 3,000 Russian soldiers in the region withdrew, and more than 1,200 Russian soldiers were neutralized. At the same time, it is said that nearly 200 Russian soldiers had to surrender. The Ukrainian army, which launched the offensive that Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky had been talking about for months, managed to recapture a large region under Russian occupation for the first time in a long time. The Russian army, which managed to quickly occupy these regions in the first months of the war, is now trying to protect these occupied territories. However, the unfavorable conditions created by the war started to affect Russian soldiers very badly. For this reason, the Russian army has long preferred to stay in a defensive position instead of attacking in the first months of the war. The fact that the Russian economy was a great power and the Russian army inventory had more advanced weapons gave the impression that Russia could completely occupy Ukrainian territory. However, over time, with the support of the US and Western countries, modern weapons and equipment sent to Ukraine helped to equalize the situation between Russia and Ukraine. The Ukrainian army, after acquiring important military weapons such as long-range missiles, tanks, and air defense systems, began to give the Russian army a very difficult time. Russian leader Vladimir Putin was constantly launching airstrikes to break the Ukrainian army's power. Since Ukraine did not have an air defense system, it had great difficulty in preventing these airstrikes. However, The Patriot air defense system sent to Ukraine by the United States enabled the Ukrainian army to regain control of the Ukrainian airspace. Most of the airstrikes launched by the Russian army to prevent the Ukrainian army's offensive were also prevented, thanks to these air defense systems. While the whole world thought that the Russian army would occupy Ukrainian territory, within a few weeks, the heroic Ukrainian soldiers managed to mislead everyone. Now the Russian army is only trying to protect the occupied territories because recently there have been big problems within the Russian army. The biggest of these problems is that Russian soldiers have started to lay down their arms and leave Ukrainian territory. Although Russian government officials do not want to disclose what is happening on Ukrainian territory, the Ukrainian government is constantly sharing the latest data about the war. Moreover, since the beginning of the war, thousands of Russian soldiers have deserted and left Ukrainian territory. The confessions of the Russian commander, Andrei Medvedev, who came to Ukraine to fight with the Wagner troops during the winter months, shocked everyone with his confessions after fleeing Ukraine. Medvedev, who fled the battlefield and sought asylum in Norway, made many confessions about the Russian army and Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the Wagner mercenary company. Medvedev said that Russian recruits sent to Ukraine were forced to fight, and those who did not want to fight were beaten or imprisoned by their own commanders. Medvedev also stated that many recruits were shot by their own commanders when they did not want to fight, and admitted that the Russian army committed many war crimes in Ukraine. Medvedev stated that the Russian soldiers serving in Ukraine had problems with ammunition and supplies, and that the soldiers on the battlefield were extremely inexperienced. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the CEO of the Wagner mercenary company, confessed that they were collecting prisoners in Russia and taking them to fight on Ukrainian soil. These words of Prigozhin, who stated that they gave up collecting prisoners due to the criticism they received, turned out to be a lie. Russian commander Medvedev stated that only more than 6 prisoner soldiers were given to him. Another problem that has recently emerged within the Russian army is the struggle between Wagner soldiers and Chechen soldiers, but the majority of Wagner soldiers consist of prisoners. It has become very difficult to keep these soldiers under control, trading shots on soldiers as second-class soldiers. Wagner soldiers started to cause problems within the headquarters. Wagner commanders divided most of the supplies and ammunition sent to the headquarters among themselves and gave the rest to Chechen soldiers. For this reason, many Chechen soldiers decided to lay down their arms in protest against Vladimir Putin. Chechen soldiers who say that they are forced to eat only one meal a day say that Vladimir Putin does not value them and that they were sent to Ukraine to die. The protests that started to increase within the army started to make Putin very uneasy. However, many protests are now being organized within Russia's borders. Russian people who are against Putin and the war continue to protest the war on the streets. The war in Eastern Europe has altered all NATO members in the West. Russia's aggressive policies push the USA and its allies to take very drastic measures. All members of the alliance took action against the threats posed by Russian aggression in the Baltics, Scandinavian geography, and Eastern Europe, especially on the Russian border. The members of the alliance are trying to increase their armies to the maximum power level, just as Russia revised its moves in the course of the Ukraine war. NATO is creating new plans against the Russian threat. For Russian President Vladimir Putin, the war in Ukraine now means more than keeping NATO's expansion in check. The USA sensed a serious danger for itself in these attacks and mobilized its troops in Eastern Europe. The US and NATO have recently increased their military presence on the Russian border almost 8 times. NATO decided to increase the number of soldiers ready for war by 7.5 times. As a result of the meeting of the defense ministers of the alliance, it was decided to increase the number of combat-ready troops from 40,000 to 300,000 and to strengthen the air support on the eastern flank. This turned into a mutual elbow contact between the two world giants. Rising tensions in Eastern Europe are now overshadowed by the Ukraine war against the Russian threat. Reactions from NATO's top officials continued to come. Recently, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that the Western military alliance will increase its high readiness forces to over 300,000 in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine for no reason. Statistics have shown that NATO has reached a much larger number considering the size of the Russian threat. Stoltenberg said, "We will strengthen our forward defenses, transform the NATO response force, and increase the number of our highly prepared forces to over 300,000. However, this means that a much larger power is ready against Russia. According to recent reports, a significant NATO contingent of approximately 490,000 troops is being deployed by NATO armies in Eastern Europe and the Baltic states bordering Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. There are a total of 239,500 troops NATO forces in Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Finland. In countries bordering Russia, more than 90% of NATO's forces are stationed on the border of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. The most important and strategic country in NATO's Eastern Bloc is undoubtedly Poland. The U.S. Army has deployed its most special weapons and war machines in Poland to the Russian border and the Ukrainian border. There are 161,500 NATO forces in the Polish Army, including 150,000 active military personnel and 11,500 U.S. troops. There are a total of 40,000 NATO forces in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania with a joint NATO force. In addition, Finland, the newest member of NATO, has a 1,200-kilometer border with Russia. There are 38,000 troops in Finland. At the same time, there are 15,100 troops in Slovakia, 24,800 troops in Hungary, 79,300 troops in Romania, and 30,000 troops in Bulgaria, which are other Eastern European countries. These units have a total of 149,200 NATO military forces. In total, NATO's strength in Eastern Europe is 388,700 troops, including 239,500 troops in Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Finland, and 149,200 troops in Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. The United States brought its military numbers in Europe to the point of the Cold War long beforehand. We can see that this number actually stands out as one of the main influence points in the race for supremacy. The total number of U.S. soldiers in these countries is around 20,000. However, the U.S. Army sent a total of 120,000 troops to Europe, making the largest deployment of the last century. In other words, 100,000 U.S. troops are waiting in a state of alert against Russia and other European countries, mainly in Germany and the UK. When we add 100,000 U.S. troops to 389,000 NATO troops in Eastern Europe and Nordic, we can see that 489,000 NATO forces are on the high alert against Russia. This data reflects NATO's strength only on the borders of Russia and Belarus and in Eastern Europe. The main military power of countries such as the UK, Italy, Turkey, Germany, Norway, and Denmark, which are among the largest military forces of NATO, are not included in the 489,000 troops. However, the armies of these countries are also on high alert against Russia in the event of a war. These countries will add paramilitary groups to the war, just as the Ukrainians did. Paramilitary groups of the Eastern Bloc are not covered in our current analysis, but they are of paramount importance. We see this very clearly from the partisan guerrilla movement in Ukraine. This preparation shows us that NATO has expanded its vigilance against an attack from Russia. At the same time, NATO is going to a serious restructuring against the nuclear threat that we mentioned at the beginning. In recent months, NATO countries carried out nuclear deterrence exercises in Europe with the participation of a large number of warplanes. In addition, NATO takes very critical security measures not only in Eastern Europe, but also in the Baltic region. While Baltic air policing intercepts a Russian jet almost daily, alliance navies form a joint force in the Baltic Sea, with the environmental security problems, increasing maritime traffic, and regional warming in the Black Sea. Russia tried to dominate these areas, aware of the danger. The revised NATO doctrine called for a reliable naval presence in the Baltic Sea in recent days for deterrence and territorial defense. As part of this call, the biggest exercise of the year, Defender 23, which includes the Baltics, was announced following the start of this exercise. A historic step came from the U.S. Navy forces near Norway in the Baltic Sea. The U.S. Navy's 6th Fleet has finally re-entered the Baltic Sea to bring justice after a long hiatus. The USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier carrying the commander of the U.S. 6th Fleet strike for NATO, the biggest firepower of the alliance, was now deployed in the Baltics in response to the next 30 exercises by the Russian Navy. As the world's largest aircraft carrier overshadowed the Baltics with its splendor, Putin was witnessing moment by moment the power of the U.S. Navy. The ship is the world's largest aircraft carrier, and the exercises, which will begin in the coming days, are a show of strength for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. At a time when tensions are rising between the 31-nation military alliance from Europe, the ship is expected to depart from the Arctic a few days before the start of the Arctic Challenge exercise on May 29th and collect 150 aircraft and 3,000 military personnel from 14 Western countries. These exercises will be carried out from close to the Russian border in the east to the Norwegian seacoast in the west. Meanwhile, Jens Stoltenberg has warned earlier that Russia will not win the war, otherwise it may encourage authoritarian leaders around the world. The alliance's Secretary-General called for Ukraine's continuation, saying that Ukraine's territorial gains would not have been possible without NATO's support. Despite recent gains, Jens Stoltenberg said that a Russian victory would be bad for all of us in Europe and North America. All of NATO, because it would send a message to authoritarian leaders, not just Putin, but China as well. They will be able to achieve their goals by using ruthless military force. The Joe Biden administration has described China as America's biggest threat to its national security strategy. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said that Russia's announcement that it will deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus shows that the joint statement made by Russia and China days ago was made up of empty promises. Stoltenberg said NATO has so far seen no signs that Russia's following Putin's announcement. The war in Ukraine is proceeding exactly as the Ukrainian armed forces want, with the support of the Western states to Kiev. But Putin is ready to do whatever he can to upset this balance, having already destroyed Russia's next 20 years. Putin is dragging his country into greater chaos every day as the war continues. Considering these measures of NATO, we see that the Russian army is not at a level to pose a new threat. At the moment, the Russian army cannot carry out more than one offensive operation, even on the Ukrainian fronts. And we see that the only thing left in Putin's hands is his nuclear trump card. Although Western and even Russian experts think that this is just a bluff, the US administration and NATO chief Stoltenberg take this seriously and act with a principle of maximum security. If you think that the war between Ukraine and Russia is a war of physical power, you are very wrong. This battle is purely a battle of wills and is psychological. You can invade a country's territory, but never their heart. You can only win when the will and belief of the other party collapses. Although the Russian army occupied 15% of Ukraine, it could not enjoy the joy of victory in any of its gains. On the contrary, every attack of the Russian army resulted in heavy defeats. Despite the fact that the Russian army was superior to the Ukrainian army, both in terms of military equipment and units, it suffered the heaviest defeat in its history on the Ukrainian fronts. Wars are not won by weapons, but by brave and faithful soldiers. Faith is the fuel of brave soldiers. And as long as you don't stop believing, it will not let you down and lead you to victory. While the Ukrainians were in a life-or-death struggle to liberate their country, the Russian soldiers became mere pawns and cannon fodder, fighting for their leader's ego. Together with all of this, a series of failures on the front lines, lack of ammunition, inadequate training and nutrition, greatly demoralized the Russians. Demoralized Russian soldiers also did not believe in Vladimir Putin's war. As we mentioned, faith is the soldier's fuel. If this ends, defeat and surrender are inevitable. For this reason, Russian soldiers consider fleeing the pocket or surrendering to the Ukrainian army as their primary option to save their lives. Ukraine is striving to save not only the lives of its own soldiers, but also the lives of Russian soldiers. For this, Ukraine has implemented the I Want to Live project. It opened a new door to life for Russian soldiers. About 4,300 Russian soldiers surrendered to Ukraine last April. According to reports from Ukrainian officials involved in the I Want to Live hotline project in March, this number was around 3,200, and in the previous months it was between 1,500 to 2,000. By the end of April, about 17,000 Russian soldiers had already surrendered to the Ukrainian army. In May, there was a record increase in the number of Russians surrendering to the Ukrainian army. In May, more than 6,000 surrenders took place, with an average of 200 daily surrenders of Russian soldiers. Ukrainian officials added that from March to May, the number of Russian applications increased by 100%, and the vast majority of these applicants reached them from Bakhmut. The main reason for this increase was the depleted resources of the Russian army. the rapidly depleted morale of the soldiers, and their will to live. More than 23,000 Russian applicants have surrendered through the project since it started in September 2022. Vitaly Matvienko, head of the Ukraine hotline, said in a statement. Meanwhile, Ukraine developed new strategies and demonstrated remarkable ingenuity to persuade Russian soldiers to surrender. Ukrainian officials said the Ukrainian military has designed its own unique advertising campaigns. Authorities reported that Ukrainian troops printed special leaflets, loaded them into shells, and fired them in Russian-controlled territory with a Grad rocket launcher. The leaflets in Russian say that Russians should surrender voluntarily, and they give accurate statistics of the Ukrainian General Staff on Russian casualties. The brochures also include phone numbers they can call if they wanted to turn themselves in. The brochures also have a price list showing how much money you can make if you surrender with equipment. For example, soldiers who deliver a tank can receive a payment of $10,000. Analysts predict that more and more Russians will surrender, noting that unlike Russia, Ukraine complies with the Geneva Conventions when it comes to respecting the rights of prisoners of war. This situation of the Russian army is, of course, due to the careless treatment of Russian President Vladimir Putin's soldiers. Russian soldiers are fighting on the front line without weapons, ammunition, shelter, and almost starving. Depressed and unmotivated, Russian soldiers show courage and seek no other way than to escape. Considering the loss of soldiers of the Russian army, it is understandable that the soldiers wanted to flee from their troops. So why did the Russian army come to this? Russian President Vladimir Putin predicted that the Ukraine war would be short-lived. In his words, the war would be over in 2 weeks, and the Russian army prepared accordingly. Although the Russian army came to the front of Kiev in the first days of the war, the Russian troops were forced to retreat after the strong resistance of the Ukrainian army. Although the Russian army then launched a series of attacks on Ukraine from the eastern Ukrainian border and via the Crimea, the firepower soon ran out as the army was unprepared. The Ukrainian army used the pause of the Russian army quite well equipped with the latest technology weapons of the West, such as HIMARS. The Ukrainian army made an epic on the battlefield, together with its soldiers and special forces trained in Western countries such as the USA and UK. Thus begun the great offensive of Ukraine in autumn. After that, the motivation and psychology of the Russian soldiers fell. The loss of an important city like Kherson by the Russian army destroyed the morale of the army and the war effort. Although Putin blamed his commanders and dismissed them, the soldiers were unarmed, hungry, and lacking basic necessities. After that, desertions from the army began. Some of the 300,000 Russian youth recorded by the partial mobilization decision announced in the autumn were sent to Ukraine. But 300 to 500 mobilized soldiers were eliminated by the Ukrainian army almost every day as the commanders kept the mobilized soldiers on the front line. The vast majority of those who remained either laid down their weapons and surrendered to the Ukrainian army or fled from the front and went to mainland Russia on their own. A recent example of these capitulations occurred again recently when a Ukrainian army drone was given the chance to surrender to a Russian soldier who begged him not to bombard himself in Bakhmut. The touching drone footage released by the Ukrainian military shows the moment when a soldier fleeing Putin's troops is given the option to surrender instead of an explosive device. The soldier received a message with details on how to surrender to him. In the message, the Russian soldier was told to leave his trench and go out into the open terrain and be taken to the Ukrainian position by a drone. The soldier also agreed to surrender while signaling that he would follow the drone over the bodies of dead Russian troops to Ukrainian captivity. Yuri Fedorenko, the commander of the drone in Ukraine's 92nd Mechanized Brigade, shared a video of the peace offer on social media. The video is a charitable act of the Ukrainian armed forces in Bakhmut. The drone combat aircraft team detected a Russian soldier who asked him not to bomb himself. Our team left him a note with a request to surrender and track a drone. It was shared with the note that he accepted, even though his friends fired from behind him. Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, said the soldier is currently in custody. The Russian soldier noticed the drone coming to pick him up and started making gestures to show his desire to surrender. Afterwards, the Ukrainian infantry and scouts accompanied him to the Ukrainian positions. According to Ukrainian Ground Forces Commander General Alexander Chersky, the striking footage came as Ukrainian forces made significant advances in the Bakhmut region this week. The claim was not immediately confirmed, But the Wagner mercenary group that led the crushing attack on Bakhmut said its forces were considering withdrawing due to insufficient ammunition. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry used the surrender project as a mockery against the Kremlin. The Defense Ministry said the closer the counterattack, the closer the surrender season. Don't wait for the heat. The most favorable conditions now used expressions. Officials have long touted that Ukraine will launch a counterattack this spring to reclaim its territory in parts of Russian-occupied southern and eastern Ukraine. Although both sides have been at a stalemate in the battle for Bakhmut for months, brutal fighting around the city in eastern Ukraine came with heavy losses for Kiev and Moscow. But with White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby reporting that Russia has lost more than 100,000 troops since December, including 20,000 deaths, officials estimated Russia's casualties to be much higher than Ukraine's. It is difficult to predict what the coming days will show us about the Ukrainian war, but it seems that the Russian army will not be able to continue this war any longer as long as it suffers such losses. So what you guys think about this issue? Please express your thoughts in the comments.